Hi, welcome to Games 101. This is the cornerstone class of the NYU Game Center. This is me. I'll be the main instructor for this class, so if you have any problems or questions, feel free to reach out to me. The basic premise of this class is that games matter. They don't just matter because they're technology. They don't just matter because they're a thriving pop culture industry. They don't just matter because they're violent or educational or juvenile or virtual or addictive or digital or ideological tools or potential vectors for revolutionary energy. They might be all of those things, but that's not the reason that games matter. Games matter the way that music matters, the way that stories matter, the way that film matters, the way that poems and paintings and plays matter. These are things that we do for their own sake. Games are, like those other activities, a core ingredient of what it means to be human. Games are one of the inexplicable, unjustifiable, unquestionable parts of a well-lived human life. Games are culture. They're something like music, literature, and film. Games can be meaningful and beautiful and interesting and important in the same way that these other things are. But they have their very own particular method of being meaningful. And understanding this particular type of meaning is challenging and worthwhile. Games are worthy of our time and attention because we get something unique and valuable from them. And we should develop our appreciation of them in order to get more of the meaning and beauty that they have to offer. The purpose of this class is to build advanced literacy in games, to hone our ability to read games, to make sense of them, to increase our ability to appreciate them and understand them. Now, if you're here, you probably already have some kind of active relationship to games. But we want to add gears to that relationship to make it broader and deeper and sharper so that it can take you further. So how are we going to do that? Well, here's how the class is going to work. Every week, you'll watch a recorded lecture, very much like this one, about a particular theme, historical period, or genre of games. And I'll post these videos on Friday morning, and you'll have 3 days to watch them. Then on Mondays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, we will all get together live online for a dialogue session. During this time, I will have a conversation with a guest about the topic of that week's lecture. Often this guest will be another Game Center faculty member. In fact, this class is the collaborative work of the entire Game Center faculty. So even though I'm going to be the one giving the lectures this semester, it's actually a big group project that we all work on together. So these dialogue sessions will also be a way for you to get to know some of the faculty and what they're all about. And during these sessions, we'll also be fielding questions from all of you, so we can dig into the topics from the lecture in a more conversational way. And we'll also record these dialogue sessions, so if you're unable to attend them because of time zone issues, you can still get access to them. Each week, led by your recitation instructor, you'll play one or more of the games featured in or related to that week's lecture. Now, the recitations are really the heart of Games 101, because games literacy requires hands-on experience. Games are participatory. They're something like music, novels, and movies, but one of the main things that makes them different from those is the degree to which they rely on the active participation of the audience to make them work. To really understand games, you have to play them, not just talk about them or watch a video. Now, there will be tests and quizzes. You'll be tested on key ideas and facts that are presented in the lectures. You'll be expected to be able to identify and discuss key features of the games that are discussed. And each week you'll get a quiz guide, which is designed to help direct your attention to key ideas from the lecture. The test and quiz questions are all taken from these quiz guides. The quiz will happen at the beginning of the recitation sessions each week, so make sure you've watched the video and read the quiz before the recitation session begins. Critical play reports. Over the course of the semester, you will write 4 short one-page papers called critical play reports. We will provide a set of different prompts for these papers. You will choose a prompt, pick one of the games that has been discussed in the lecture, play it for some additional time, 1 or 2 more hours, and write up your thoughts about it. Participation. Now, part of your grade is going to be being present for the recitation sessions, participating, being active, and so showing up and actively contributing is definitely a requirement for getting a good grade. This is somewhat an unconventional class, so I wanted to share some of the notes about the structure, some of the ideas about where this class comes from, and help you understand how we think about the class and what its purpose is, and also as suggestions for how to maximize the value you get from your time here. So first of all, let's talk about the actual subject of this class. This class is going to cover a lot of different kinds of games, digital and non-digital. We're going to end up talking a lot about video games, but from the perspective that video games share a bunch of essential qualities with board games, card games, party games, and sports. This class looks at video games within the larger context of games and play as an ancient and ubiquitous aspect of human culture. Our approach says that tennis and Donkey Kong have a lot in common, and that thinking deeply about tennis can help you understand what's happening in Donkey Kong, and vice versa. So for example, today's lecture, we're going to look at a bunch of very old, historical, pre-computer games. But as you will see, there are aspects of these ancient games that illuminate important features of games that we play on our consoles and computers and on our phones today. Games that came out yesterday or that are coming out tomorrow. So that's the first thing about this class. We're going to be looking at video games and traditional non-video games both, as all belonging to this larger cultural form of games. Another thing about this class is that it's based on the rather traditional format of the art history survey course. Periodically, we're going to highlight a particular game or series of games because we think that it's an especially good illustration of an important idea, or because it was very influential, or marks an important historical moment, or just if for any reason we believe that it has become a game that someone with a high degree of games literacy should probably be aware of. We call these key games, and every lecture will have some. And just like in a traditional art history class, we're going to ask you to learn a few concrete facts about these key games. We want you to be able to identify them by looking at an image, and be able to say when they were first created, who created them, what type of game it was, and what part of the world it came out of. Now, ultimately, genuine literacy isn't about memorizing facts. It's the ability to see patterns and connections, to understand relationships, and fit things together into a meaningful overall picture. However, we believe that these more advanced forms of cultural literacy benefit from a foundation of factual knowledge about who made what, when, where. So, whenever you see this key icon, remember that you'll be expected to know these details about that game. Now, this doesn't mean that we think these particular games are the greatest games of all time, or the most important, or anything like that. We just think that they are valuable stepping stones for constructing a shared path through this complicated history. Let's talk about love. Games are a big, complicated cultural form. And by the end of this semester, we want all of you to have a solid foundation for a broad, well-informed critical literacy about this form. Now, ultimately, we want this critical literacy to deepen and magnify your appreciation of games and increase the meaning and pleasure that you get out of them. But developing this broader cultural literacy sometimes means going beyond the particular perspective of the enthusiast or the fan. If you know every single thing there is to know about one particular game or genre of game, that's great. But we want you to also be able to lean back and see that game or genre in a larger perspective, to see it more dispassionately in the context of other games and genres and ideas. Likewise, if there are certain kinds of games that you just don't like, that's great. But we want you to also be able to lean forward and immerse yourself in games that you aren't already naturally inclined to enjoy, to temporarily suspend your existing preferences in order to understand what's going on in these games for the people who do love them. We think of these lean back and lean forward abilities as gears that you add to your relationship with games. They don't replace your existing passions and tastes. They just give you new modes of experience that increase your ability to see the larger patterns and connections and ideas that advanced cultural literacy is all about. One last note. This class can be challenging. It's not a class to take for easy credits. So here are some things to remember that will help you do well in the class. First of all, watch the videos. Everything you need to know to do well is covered in the weekly lectures. Play the games. This is the most important thing of all. Really play them and think about them. Think about your own experience while playing them, and think about where they came from, how they're made, how they work, and why. Developing the skill of playing any game in this thoughtful and observant way is a life-altering superpower. The quiz guides will help you pass every test and get a good grade. Your recitation instructor is here to help, and so you should reach out to them whenever there's something you need help understanding. But again, let me emphasize, this one is the most important. So, having laid out the plan for the class as a whole, let's jump into lecture number 1, Foundations. Here are some of the key concepts that we're going to go over in this Foundations lecture. Games are very old. To understand video games, you need to see them in the context of the whole history of games that leads up to them, including some very old games that are still actively played by large communities of players in the present. We're going to talk about theme and mechanics. We're going to look at how these terms apply to different kinds of games and what they mean. And there are some other terms that we're going to encounter and discuss: depth, elegance, game trees, state space. And we're going to look at how games adapt to and reflect different kinds of cultures. So here we have our first key game of the class. We begin with Knucklebones. Knucklebones is at least 5,000 years old, probably much, much older. It's a game, or a family of games really, that was originally played using the knucklebones of sheep, although eventually people started making versions out of brass, wood, stone, glass, or other materials. We don't know exactly where they originated, but archaeologists have found knucklebones in ancient sites all over Egypt, Turkey, and other locations of early human settlement, from when the Stone Age was transitioning into the Bronze Age. Now you can see a timeline at the bottom, which gives you a sense of where things are in history. In this video, we're going to look at games that range from 5000 BCE, which is about 7,000 years ago, to 600 CE, which is about 1400 years ago. BCE stands for Before Common Era, and CE stands for Common Era. So, why are there so many knucklebones scattered all over the Fertile Crescent? Why were people obsessed with knucklebones? What were they doing with them? This image kind of gives you a clue, because this shows you what they look like, and that's a big part of the answer. Because of their shape, knucklebones move in a particular way. When you throw them, they tumble and scatter, making their behavior a little bit hard to predict, but also somewhat controllable. These physical properties are what make knucklebones fun to play with.
Oh boy.
And then you catch them. You do one. Yeah, I catch one. And then you do two. On video. And you have to push them together. Please get two. And I just do it with it.
Does that look familiar? Yeah. Knucklebones are basically jacks. Because of the way they move and how you can manipulate them, the play of knucklebones is this enjoyment of manipulating these complex and semi-predictable objects. But there's another interesting property that knucklebones have because of their shape. When they come to a stop, they always land on one of 4 distinct sides. And so another way that people played with knucklebones was to give each side a point value and then throw them and count up the points that we're showing. Knucklebones are a very early example of dice. Originally, they were used as oracle objects, which people believed could give them a glimpse into the future. So the same property that makes them fun to throw and to manipulate makes them interesting to throw and just look at the outcome. Knucklebones are semi-predictable. As they tumble around, it's hard to know exactly where they're going to end up. But they're not going to go everywhere. They're not going to roll under the couch or disappear into the far corners of the room. And we don't know exactly how they're going to land, but we know it's going to be some combination of exactly these 4 discrete ways. This semi-predictability, this organized randomness, this controlled chaos produces 2 kinds of play activity: a physical game and a game of pure luck. A game of doing and a game of knowing, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. These 2 radically different ingredients of gameplay, skill and luck, sprouting from the same oddly shaped objects. So, Knucklebones supported two distinct but related forms of play: the skill-based play of tossing and grabbing, and the luck-based play of dice, which is kind of surprising and wonderful. We have these two vast categories of very different kinds of games, but here we see at the very dawn of civilization how their origins are tangled tightly together. And it was the physical quality of the particular size and shape of Knucklebones that gave them this interesting behavior that led to these different kinds of play. What does it mean for behavior to be interesting? What is it about Knucklebones that fascinates the human mind? They're a little corner of the world that is carved off in a way that makes it challenging but possible to manipulate, and unpredictable but in an organized, predictable way. They're a little slice of the world that is mysterious and hard to control, but in a way that can be known and can be mastered. And finally, even though we're pegging the creation of Knucklebones to the period where we have lots of clear archaeological records of their existence, it's probably even much older than that. Some people speculate that Cro-Magnons may have played with Knucklebones, which leads to an interesting related question. When did humans first start playing games? It's worth remembering that we're not the only species that plays. It's impossible to watch this video and not feel some sense of shared experience that crosses over the boundary between people and animals. I mean, this little guy is definitely playing a game, and it looks like a good one. So, let's put the topic of play and games into historical perspective. Almost 2 million years ago, we find Homo ergaster, one of our earliest recognizable tool-using ancestors. 300,000 years ago, we find the earliest evidence of our ancestors burying their dead. 200,000 years ago, we, Homo sapiens, appear on the scene. 150,000 years ago, we find the first evidence of what we would recognize as culture and fabrication, including clothing and decorative jewelry. Also around this time is probably when we started to develop the ability to form complex sounds into language. After that comes everything we can confidently call human culture. But because play and games are ubiquitous, not just among humans, but even in animals, we can speculate that long before all of this began, our ancestors were already playing. In his book Homo Ludens, 20th century Dutch historian Johan Huizinga famously proposed that play not only predated culture, but was the foundation that allowed for culture to evolve. He said play is older than culture, for culture, however inadequately defined, always presupposes human society, and animals have not waited for man to teach them their playing. So, while Knucklebones might be the earliest game pieces that we know about for sure, I think it's safe to say that Knucklebones was probably not the first game. It is, however, one that we know how to play, because people still play it. However, not all games have had the long life that Knucklebones has enjoyed. Let's look at a game from history that we've forgotten how to play. The game of SENET, our next key game. SENET is a board game from ancient Egypt, from about 2,000 years later than the earliest evidence we have of Knucklebones. SENET is a very early example of a familiar kind of game, the racing game. Players roll dice and then move their pieces, attempting to be the first to get to the end of the track. In SENET, the most common form of dice were the sticks that you see here, sticks that could be tossed and would land on one of two different sides. However, Knucklebones were also sometimes used as dice in the game of SENET. Due to similarities in the objects used to play the game, we believe that SENET was influenced by an even earlier game, this game, the royal game of Ur. We don't know exactly how these games were played, but we're pretty certain that they involved each player rolling dice and then moving their pieces along the track on the board until they reached the end. That might have also involved some light player interaction, such as sending a player's piece back when you land on it. We also know that it was a very, very popular game, played by Egyptians from all levels of society. On the left, we have a well-preserved depiction of Queen Nefertiti playing SENET. And on the right is a relief found in the tomb of Pepi Ankh, dating to about 2300 BCE. It depicts two people playing SENET and an exchange between them. The player on the left says, It has alighted. Be happy, my heart, for I shall cause you to see it taken away. The player on the right responds, you speak as one weak of tongue, for passing is mine. Yeah, that's right. 5,000-year-old trash talk. As far as we know, SENET started as a purely abstract game. But over time, the game took on a certain kind of religious significance. The setbacks and advances on the board were taken to symbolize the difficulties that one faces during the journey to the afterlife. These thematic changes to the mechanics were indicated by visual changes to tiles on the board. For example, square 16 was called the House of Netting and meant loss of a turn. In the netherworld, sinners, the enemies of Ra, were entangled in executioner's nets, tortured and annihilated in pits of fire. In contrast, the House of Rejuvenation, square 26, brought a free turn and was always desirable. So, just like knucklebones were sometimes used as a fortune-telling instrument to try to predict the future, the game of SENET was a kind of ceremonial exploration of human fate, a miniature recreation of the supernatural forces that governed human destiny. When we say that SENET is a game with both theme and mechanics, but what exactly do we mean by those two terms? Let's take a minute to define them. When we say mechanics, we're talking about units of gameplay, recombinable chunks of game action that are often shared between different games. For example, roll the dice and then move a piece that many squares. That's a mechanic. Or, when you land on an opponent's piece, you capture it. That's an example of a mechanic. When we describe the game as a collection of mechanics, we sometimes refer to it as a system. The system is the overall game described as the properties of the interconnected set of materials and rules that determine how the game unfolds. And theme, we mean we say that SENET is a game with both theme and mechanics, but what exactly do we mean by these terms? Let's take a moment to define them. When we talk about mechanics, we're talking about units of gameplay, recombinable game actions that are often shared between different games. For example, roll the dice and move a piece that many squares. That's a mechanic. Or when you land on your opponent's piece, you capture it. That's a mechanic. Now, the overall game described as a collection of mechanics is sometimes referred to as a system. A game system is the properties of the game as an interconnected set of materials and rules that determine how the actions of the game unfold. And when we use the term theme, we're talking about the fictional or representational aspects of the game. For example, a game about falling in love, a game about snowboarding, or a game about the journey of the soul. Possibly a game about all three. Now, the name SENET means passing. In this painting for Nefertiti's tomb, we see the queen playing SENET against an invisible opponent. She's playing out her journey of passing into the afterlife, trying to successfully navigate through the traps and pitfalls according to the twists and turns of fate. The game of SENET can help us understand some things about ancient Egyptian culture, about how they thought about the world. And studying the games that we play here and now can help us understand our present culture and our own values. What will future historians come to know about us based on the games that we play? This is one of the questions we'll explore in this class. So, SENET, an ancient Egyptian racing game with interconnected theme and mechanics about a journey through the afterlife, a game with religious significance. Now, there was another game from around the same time that, unlike SENET, humans still play today, Backgammon, our next key game. Backgammon is a board game that originated in ancient Persia, the region of the world that is now modern Iran. Like SENET and the royal game of Ur, Backgammon is a racing game. Two players are competing to move their pieces across the board and carry them off the other side. However, in this case, the pieces aren't moving through squares, but across the pips, these triangular markings that line the two sides. In Backgammon, you roll 2 dice and then assign those 2 numbers to 2 of your pieces. Any individual pieces that are left by themselves on a space are vulnerable to be knocked back to the beginning of the game if the other player lands on them. The number of pieces and the way that they interact creates a fast-paced game with lots of back and forth movement as the flow of pieces intersect and overlap. It's a game of statistical thinking as players try to optimize their chance of winning within a highly random system. Modern backgammon strategy requires a deep analysis that uses computers to model different situations on the board. Backgammon is especially popular in the Middle East, but it's actively played all over the world, including a very serious international competitive tournament scene. The most recent world champions were from Mexico, Japan, France, Sweden, and Turkey. It's quite striking when you think about it that this 5,000-year-old game is still being played, not as a historical curiosity, but as contemporary entertainment. Modern backgammon involves advanced analysis, and expert play requires mastering a lot of complex strategic concepts. The fact that there is still an active, competitive scene and that people still analyze and study different strategies for playing it demonstrates how complex and interesting backgammon is, how much mystery is packed into this simple system. 5,000 years is a long time for something to remain popular. In fact, let's list a few things that are younger than backgammon. The United States of America, French, the language, the unification of China, the Western philosophical tradition, the Eastern philosophical tradition, human settlement on the island of Madagascar, the use of iron for cooking or warfare, the pyramids at Giza, and the domestication of the camel. It's remarkable for anything so ancient to still be active in people's everyday lives. It's as if you could still rent a room in the Taj Mahal, or people still read the Epic of Gilgamesh for pure entertainment. And backgammon might not even be done evolving. This is the doubling cube. The doubling cube adds a layer of complexity to the betting aspect of backgammon. And the doubling cube was introduced to the game just 100 years ago, in the 1920s, in New York City, on the Lower East Side. A doubling cube makes a huge difference in the game. It makes the game smarter, harder, and deeper, because players are not just choosing the right moves, they need to correctly analyze the relative strength of different board positions. So backgammon, an ancient game that's still actively played, a deep game of complex strategy that is still evolving. Our next key game is another game that is still actively played by people today, MANCALA, which is a family of two-player board games that originated in Eastern Africa, probably not too far from where SENET and backgammon originated. Known as the sowing game, MANCALA is a genre of different games that all share a similar count and capture core mechanic. There are many examples of MANCALA games throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Two of the most popular MANCALA games are Awara, or Io, and Bao. Unlike SENET and backgammon, MANCALA isn't a racing game. The goal is to capture all of your opponent's pieces, which you do by choosing one of the spaces or pits on your side of the board, scooping up all the pieces or seeds, and then moving around the board, dropping off one piece at a time in every pit that you pass over. Where you drop your final piece determines if you get to capture some of your opponent's pieces. Here's a video of people playing Bao. One of the interesting things about MANCALA is that it doesn't use dice. It's a simple game with no randomness, and yet it has supported the dedicated attention of millions of players for centuries. Sometimes we describe games like this, games like MANCALA and backgammon, as being deep games. The term depth, when used in this way, means the capacity for a game to sustain long-term serious study and play. MANCALA seems so simple. It has no randomness, no hidden information, not all that many choices per move, and yet somehow the game remains interesting, challenging, and fun for generation after generation of players. To understand how, we should look at the way that the results of every move affect the overall state of the whole game board, and how this leads to a surprising amount of complexity. One example of the depth of MANCALA is the phenomenon known as perpetual sowing. Like most games that have a long history and a lot of depth, MANCALA has been studied by mathematicians in an effort to understand its complexity. And one of the things that they've discovered was the possibility for perpetual sowing. Remember, the basic move in MANCALA consists of picking up the contents of a pit and distributing the pieces over consecutive pits on the board. This is called sowing. Because of the rules about when and how you're allowed to continue, there are possible arrangements of pieces that could lead to a situation where one move could continue for millions of cycles, or even continue forever. These situations are rare enough that they don't cause problems in ordinary human play, but mathematicians use computer modeling to discover that they exist, hidden within the vast ocean of possible game states. Okay, so what do we mean by the term game state? A single state is one particular configuration of all of the game's elements, and the state space of a game is all of the states that are possible to reach while following the rules of the game. So, for example, this is one possible state of tic-tac-toe, and the total state space of tic-tac-toe is approximately 5,500. Bao's state space is 10 to the 25th power, which is 10 million billion billion. Another way of talking about this type of complexity is in terms of game trees. A game tree is a diagram showing all the possible states of the game and the paths connecting them, the legal moves that could be taken that would move the game from one state to the next. So a game tree is a kind of map of all the possible ways a particular game could play out. Game trees are much too large and complicated to actually work out, but we can use math to estimate their overall size. And this is where you get into the really big numbers. For example, that there are more possible games of chess than there are atoms in the universe. But what's really important about this way of looking at a game, it's not just the immensity. After all, lots of things are bigger than the universe. There are more possible paintings and more possible movies than there are atoms in the universe. What's different about games is the knowability, the way that they make this immense scope visible. While playing a game, you move through the state space. You actively navigate the game tree. So similar to the way that Knucklebones took the vast uncertainty of the future and compressed it down into a manageable set of knowable outcomes, games like MANCALA take the endless, infinite complexity of the world and make it countable. So MANCALA, a family of games known as the SOWING games, originating in Eastern Africa, games of rich depth and complexity that demonstrate the idea of game states and game trees, for example, in the case of perpetual sowing. The next game we're going to look at is the game of Go, also known as Wei Qi, a board game that originated in China about 2,500 years ago. Like MANCALA, Go is another game with no randomness. In Go, the two players take turns placing stones on the board, trying to surround more territory than their opponent. And like MANCALA and backgammon, Go is another ancient game that is still widely played today. It is very popular throughout Asia and a significant ingredient in the cultures of China, Japan, and Korea. Here is a Go match played on television from about 10 years ago between Mukai Chiaki, playing white, and Yamada Kimiyo, playing black. As you can see, competitive Go is a very slow-paced and cerebral game. In this clip, we're going to see the game commentators in a second analyzing a single position. We'll watch them tracing out the game tree and analyzing some of the different ways that the situation they're looking at could play out.
はい、厳しくなってくる。
そういうことですね。
していますね。
Now, you're going to play Go in your recitation this week, so let me tell you a little bit about the basic rules. Go is played on a grid. Black and white take turns placing stones on the board, not in the spaces, but on the intersection points of the grid. And the object of the game is to surround space with your stones. The heart of the game is the capturing rule. On the left, we see a single black stone. White can capture this stone by completely surrounding it, by placing stones that occupy all of the empty points that this black stone is connected to. We call these empty points liberties, and when they're all gone, the stone is captured. The same rule applies to groups of stones. Not every black stone needs to have liberties next to it, as long as it's part of a connected group that still has liberties. But once a group is completely surrounded, all of the stones are captured. Now, one of the striking things about Go is that there's not much more to it than the rules that I just told you. And all of the thousands of years of gameplay and study and strategic analysis flows out of this very simple set of rules. Game designers talk about this quality, when you have a very simple rule set that produces a lot of interesting gameplay, as elegance. Elegance is the quality that a game has when the gameplay is very deep and rich and complex, but it also has a very small rule set. It is depth and simplicity. In Go, there are very few mechanics. There aren't many different kinds of pieces or upgrades or power-ups or extra lives. There's only one simple rule, putting pieces on the board one by one, and the surrounding rule. Elegance is also related to another game design term, the term emergence. Emergence is how we describe characteristics of a game that appear during play but are not specifically prescribed by the rules. It is the unintended or unspecified second-order consequences that happen as the result of play. Now, I'm jumping ahead to sports here, but the dunk is a great example of emergence. There's nothing in the rules of basketball that describe a dunk. But there is one simple rule that says the basket needs to be 10 feet off the ground. As a consequence of that rule and how it intersects with the other rules of basketball and with the creative energy of the players, we get the action of jumping through the air above the defenders. The same thing is true of bluffing in poker. The rules of poker don't say anything specific about bluffing. They just describe how and when you can bet or fold. Bluffing emerges as a key strategy because it's a consequence of these rules and the creative imagination of players who are doing their best to win. Likewise, for thousands of years, players have been exploring the surprising and unexpected strategic depth that emerges as a consequence of the simple rules of Go. And it is Go's immense strategic depth that has made it so popular for so long. It is the kind of game that you can devote your entire lifetime to studying, and you still feel like you're just scratching the surface. In ancient China, Go was considered one of the 4 arts, skills that were necessary to master to become a cultivated gentleman scholar, along with painting, calligraphy, and music. In the 21st century, Go became the ultimate test bed for measuring the capacity of artificial intelligence. When AlphaGo beat world champion Lei Shedol in 2016, it was a historical milestone in the history of AI and of games. So Go, the surrounding game, demonstrates the ideas of elegance and emergence, a game of immense strategic depth, which gave it an important cultural status in ancient China and made it a key milestone for modern artificial intelligence research. All right, the last game that we're going to look at today is chess. Chess is another board game that originated about 1400 years ago, around the same time as MANCALA, in the Gupta Empire of ancient India. Chess is a 2-player game of move and capture that takes place on an 8x8 board using specialized pieces, each with their own rules for movement. The goal of the game is to capture your opponent's king. Like MANCALA and Go, chess has no randomness. To give you a sense of what that looks like, here's the world champion Magnus Carlsen playing against his manager Espen Agdestein. Espen is no slouch himself. He's also a chess master.
Okay.
Da starter vi game med E4-bordene. Den kommer med kongegambit. Hvis den blir mottatt, eller ikke mottatt, det blir mottatt. Hovedidé å få et aggressivt spill med sine offiserer mot kongefløyen.
Faen, altså. Det er mulig.
We talked about Go as a game of elegance, simple rules resulting in depth. Perhaps as a result of that simplicity, Go has changed very little despite being approximately 1,000 years older than chess. But chess has a different history. It's a game that has evolved and adapted to its surroundings over time. There is some controversy about the origins of chess. Some historians believe that it may have originated in China or ancient Persia. However, the current consensus is that the first time we see something that is undeniably chess is in Gupta India around the 6th century, where it is called Chaturanga. In the 7th century, we see the game in Persia, where it is called Shatranj. The name comes from the Persian word for king, Shah. Checkmate comes from Shah Mat, the king is helpless. It is in the Islamic world where we see chess pieces become more abstract and geometrical and less representational. There's a Chinese version of chess that also appears around the same time, called Zhanqi. And this version of the game spread from China to Japan, where it turned into shogi. Western chess evolved into its modern form in Europe over the course of the Middle Ages. It was during this time that the queen was introduced and became the most powerful piece on the board. One of the distinguishing features of chess is its thematic surface. It's not a purely abstract game, and in many of its variations, the different mechanics that define how each piece moves are matched to a stylized narrative about royal intrigue and combat. These are the Lewis chessmen, which were carved out of walrus tusk in 12th century Norway. These pieces are big. Some of them are 4 inches tall, and they're hefty. That size really drives home that beyond being a strategic system, chess was also, like SENET, a narrative of life and death. And in some ways, chess continues to evolve. It's one of the most influential games you'll find in this class. In fact, here are 3 games that we're going to look at later on in Games 101, whose roots can be traced back to chess. On the left, you see Kriegspiel, in the middle, Dungeons and Dragons, and on the right, StarCraft 2. So, chess, an ancient strategy board game that originated in India, a game of complex mechanics that adapted and evolved over time with a rich, complex theme of courtly intrigue and combat. Okay, we started with 2 premises. Games are culture, games matter. Games are culture. They have always been a part of what it means to be human from before the very beginning. Wherever you have people, you have games. And games have their own unique ways of helping us make sense of the world. Games matter. Through games, we explore some of our most deeply rooted questions. Questions of life and death, of good and evil. Questions about how we are able to manipulate the world and predict the future. About the size of the universe and our place within it. There are many other ancient and important games that we could have selected here. As I said at the beginning, there is no singular canon of games, and we're not trying to create one in this course. However, the games we've talked about tonight constitute a pretty good collection of some of the great games of the world. These are games that are living, breathing culture that reaches back thousands of years to connect us to other humans living throughout history and all over the world. So, here's a reminder of some of the key concepts we looked at in today's lecture. Games are very old. To understand video games, you need to see them in the context of the whole history of games that leads up to them, including some very old games that are still actively played by large communities of players in the present. We talked about the difference between theme and mechanics and how those terms are related. And we talked about the mathematical ideas of depth, state space, game trees, of elegance and emergence. And we looked at the way that games adapt to and express different cultures. This week in recitation, we are going to be learning and playing one of these games, the game of Go. It's one of the greatest games ever made. So if you've never played it before, get ready for something special. And that's it. That's the first lecture of Games 101. I'll see you Monday for the dialogue session. Thanks.